Hello, everyone. My name is Kate Diamond, and I work with the CERTL Network. We are the Center for the Integration of Research, Teaching, and Learning, and we're a network of about 38 universities in the US and Canada that, in very broad strokes, works to make the sciences more diverse by changing how they're taught. Improving access to professional development opportunities around effective and inclusive teaching and learning is a big part of that. And that is why we're hosting this event series on high impact teaching practices. Today is the third event in this 4-part series. And today we're talking about course-based undergraduate research experiences. We'll hear from Sarah Evans from Kennesaw State University in just a bit. For now, I am going to turn things over to Tabitha Hardy to kick things off today.
Hi, everybody. So excited to have you guys join us again for part 3 of our series on high impact practices. I'm Tabitha Hardy, and I'm the Interim Assistant Vice Chancellor for Graduate Education and the Assistant Dean for Student Development and Academic Affairs at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. So as Kate mentioned, we're going to start today talking a little bit about high impact practices in teaching and focusing on course-based undergraduate research experiences. So one of our facilitators for this event has been Dr. Jerry Day, and he is a professor of sociology and the executive associate dean in the Institute for Engaged Learning at IUPUI. He works closely with the Associate Vice Chancellor for Undergraduate Education and our Institute for Engaged Learning team and other units to promote the equitable progression of IUPUI's 20,000 undergraduate students. So without further ado, happy Monday, everybody, and I'm going to turn it over to Jerry.
Thanks, Tabitha. Appreciate it. I'm doing this presentation this morning with my colleague, Sarah Evans. She's an assistant professor at Kennesaw State, and she has done course-based undergraduate research experiences for years. She and I work closely together on this national organization called High Impact Practices in the States, or HIPS in the States. We've hosted 3 conferences over the past 3 years with about 300 to 400 attendees at 3 different universities in the US. This year, actually next week, that whole conference, High Impact Practice in the States, has been folded into the IUPUI Assessment Institute. So Sarah and I have been working together for years. She's one of the founding individuals as part of HIPS in the States, been there since the very beginning. And when we thought about putting together a session on course-based undergraduate research experiences, Sarah's it. She's actually doing it and has a lot of experience doing it and does it really well. So I'm really thankful that Sarah's here with us. She's a criminal justice a scholar, and my background is in criminology, so we share that as well. And she's in the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice at Kennesaw State. So Sarah, thanks for being here. Before we get to Sarah, I just want to sort of set up our time today just very briefly. We are talking about course-based undergraduate research strategies and considerations. And our schedule for today's webinars, we're going to start off with some introductions, which we already did. We'll talk about the learning outcomes. We're going to do a very short poll, and Sarah's going to do a quick presentation on what these course-based undergraduate research experiences are. We'll do some breakout rooms to have some conversation with some questions that we've created for all of you. And we'll do a report back and then answer any questions that you might have. So that's what we have on tap for today. If you've been to the previous 2 sessions, they're structured exactly like this one. We're keeping the same format just to stay consistent. And especially if you're participating in the whole series, it should be very familiar to you. So what are our learning outcomes for today? By the end of the webinar, we're hoping that you'll be able to identify a course or courses that you could use for a CURE project in one of your courses, either that maybe you're doing now as a TA or you're teaching, or when you become a faculty member at a university and you want to do this in your own major or degree program. List strategies to prepare for a CURE project. Again, that's a course-based undergraduate research experience. And then how might you identify some potential collaborators to do this work with? Sarah has a colleague, her name's Jocelyn Evans. They're a dynamic duo, and they've developed a lot of this work together, collaborating from very different disciplines to engage students in course-based undergraduate research. And Sarah will talk more about that in a few minutes. Before we get into specifically course-based undergraduate research experiences, just again to refresh our memory, or if you did not attend any of the previous sessions we've done as part of this series, what are we talking about with high impact practices, or HIPs? We're talking about 11 different forms of experiential, engaged learning, applied learning that research has shown to benefit student learning in their success in numerous ways, promoting deep thinking, critical thinking, in terms of retention and graduation rates. These are the 11 high impact practices that research has shown to be really transformative in the lives of students. These practices take a lot of work on our part as instructors and facilitators, and a lot of work on the students' part, a lot of time on task, a lot of effort, but really transformative. And a lot of these have a public display of competence associated with them, where the student does some form of presentation, either at a conference or a professional meeting or on campus or part of a class. But these are the strategies that have been shown to really promote deep critical thinking in our students, and really gives them the professional and career readiness skills that they could use when they go into the workplace. So what we'd like to do, as we've done in the past, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and I'm going to share a Menti poll with all of you. And we'd like for you, if you would, to go to menti.com. And Anusha is going to put the information in the chat for us about the Menti, but we'd like you to go to menti.com and use the code 4050026. And what we'd like to know is, during your undergraduate education, did you have the opportunity to engage in an undergraduate research project? And there are 3 options there for you. It's yes, I participated in a mentored research project outside of a course. Yes, I participated in a research project that was part of a course, so it was embedded into a curricular course-based experience. Or no, you never participated in undergraduate research. So we'll give folks a few minutes. You do have the opportunity to select multiple answers. So you may have participated in both, a course-based experience and a research project outside of a course. So what we're trying to do here is just get a sense of who's our audience, and get you to reflect a little bit on what your undergraduate education was like, so we can do some work in linking up what we're going to talk about today with where all of you have been in your educational journey. And in looking at this right now, we've got 39 folks who have participated in a mentored research project outside of a course. We got about 26 folks who have participated in a research project that was part of a course, and then 11 who never participated in undergraduate research as an undergrad. Okay. Give folks another minute or two. Okay, so it looks like for the majority of folks, they participated in a research project outside of a course. And, you know, when we look at the scholarship, when we look at undergraduate experiences with research on college campuses, this doesn't surprise me. A lot of students first get their experience with undergraduate research when they participate in a research project with a faculty member, with a professor, either in a lab if it's STEM based, or participating with a social science faculty member helping to collect and analyze data, whether it's social survey data or qualitative data. It's also possible you could have helped a historian or someone in the English department, a faculty member in the English department, do some primary research, library research. So it doesn't surprise me that most of you have participated in a mentored research project outside of a course. What we're going to focus on is the pink bar. Yes, I participated in a research project that was part of a course, and that's going to be our focus for today. One more poll. It's a word cloud. Let me see if I can get it. In a few words, how would you describe your experience participating in undergraduate research? If you can go ahead and type that in for us, how would you describe that experience? Recognizing that many of you are affiliated with CERTL, many of you are in graduate programs that are STEM based, I'm not surprised that the vast majority of you were involved in some research experience as an undergraduate. And I'm definitely not surprised that these words are popping up right now. These experiences probably did tee you up and set you up for success in graduate school. This is fun to watch. keep going for another, let's give it another minute. So I see enlightening, motivating, impactful, eye-opening, challenging, formative, exciting. I also see unstructured and lack of guidance, which is definitely, I see Tabitha nodding her head. That's a possibility when you engage in some of these mentored experiences. Hopefully that's not the case in a course-based undergraduate research experience. And Sarah will talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But this is great. And when I think about the previous word clouds that we've done as part of the series so far, we've done a word cloud in all of them. This one seems the most diverse to me. There's no big words jumping out. There's lots of little words out there. So there's a lot of diversity in this experience. Enlightening, independent, eye-opening, and motivating, engaging seem to be the big ones that's jumping out at us right now. So this is great. Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that. I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Sarah Evans at Kennesaw State. Sarah, do you want to take it from here? And if there's anything in the mentees that you want to comment on, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Evans, and as Jerry said, I'm from Kennesaw State University and actually have a degree in sociology as well, but I am a criminologist, criminal justice scholar, and that's what I've done ever since I got out of school. So that is going to shape, sorry, I'm trying to get my PowerPoint up. That is certainly going to shape my presentation today. That's one of the things that I wanted to mention, that I am a social scientist. And so while I will do my best to bring in some, sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties. Let me pull this out. All right. Well, I'll do my best to bring in some other examples whenever I can. I just acknowledge that that is my disciplinary background is definitely social science, and the research that I've done is social science based. But I do believe that there is a lot of overlap, especially when it comes to the way that, okay, everybody see my presentation now? Okay. So I do believe that a lot of this is overlapping regardless of what science discipline you're from, and even outside the sciences to some degree. So I hope you can see overlap in your own work, even if you're in a different discipline. And I want to say a couple things really quickly before I get started about those two things that Jerry just said are the two that I wrote down: lack of guidance and unstructured. So there are lots of really great things, obviously, that lots of great benefits and experiences that individuals have engaging in undergraduate research. But part of the reason that I'm really passionate about faculty development around undergraduate research is because I think a lot of times faculty don't have the strategies, the knowledge, or the skills to do it in a more structured way that has the guidance that can make it actually a high impact experience for students. So while we know undergraduate research is an example of a high impact practice, it is not always facilitated as a high impact practice. So while I'm not going to get really in the weeds about the elements of a high impact practice today, I do just want to point that out, that there's a way you can do this type of activity without including the quality elements that really make it high impact for the students. And so some of you may have had that type of experience. So I've done a number of faculty development workshops around different aspects of undergraduate research as a high impact practice. Although today I'm going to focus really just on the course-based undergraduate research experiences and some of the strategies and things that I have thought about as I've developed my own projects in this area.
Hey, Sarah, real quick, I think
something?
the presentation's not showing exactly.
Oh, it's not?
Yeah, it's sort of cut off. Do you want me to share it from my screen and then you can tell me to advance, or do you want to try and fix it on your end? We can't see the whole thing. It's sort of cut off on the side.
Okay, that is weird. Still the same?
Yeah. Why don't you stop sharing and then I'll share mine, and then you can just tell me to advance slides.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Sorry, I don't know why it's not.
No, it's okay. We'll figure it out.
Uh,
Give me one sec here. Sorry about that, folks. And how does that look? Can you see it on your whole screen?
better?
Okay, yep.
Okay, good. I don't know. It might be that I have two monitors going. There might be something problematic with that. But
This works. Cool.
Okay, so you can go ahead and move on to the next screen, actually. So we are going to be focusing on cures or course-based undergraduate research experiences that you've already heard about, sort of how that differs from individually mentored projects. So hopefully those of you who've participated in those individually mentored projects will be able to see some differences in the way that you might structure an experience like this if you're doing a cure. And if you've participated in a cure, you might notice similarities or differences in the way that your own projects were structured. This is just sort of an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So just a brief outline. So I'm going to talk a lot about efficiency in a number of ways, because I think that is one of the best things to keep in mind as you're designing these sorts of projects is how can you be more efficient in the way that you design everything about it, because it is important to try to save time where you can. These do take more time than other sorts of experiences. I'll talk about the scope of the project and give you some examples of scaffolding, some examples from my own use of groups or teams and how that has helped. Give you a few ideas for dissemination, and then wrap up with a discussion of online versus face-to-face, especially given our current environment. So I think that, as I said, efficiency is really key. And my collaborator, Jocelyn, and I came up with this little phrase when we were developing something a few years ago that was don't reinvent the wheel, but be strategic in the wheel you choose. So we are big proponents of revising before you redo, and really going back to the resources that you've already created for perhaps for other courses or for other different types of projects, and seeing if you can use parts of that as a shell for a future assignment or assessment that in a different type of course, that you don't always have to start over from scratch. We also really like to think very big picture when we're starting out on a project. So we think that it's valuable to consider larger projects that you might not automatically assume would work in a one semester course-based undergraduate research experience. Think big first. Think about your big question, a big question that you're interested in, and then think about how you can break that down into smaller questions. So I always think back to my my PhD, my graduate level research methods class, in which my professor said, first come up with your big T question and then come up with your little R's. And those are the smaller questions that support that bigger one. And so we kind of try to take that same tactic if we're going to try to think about a long-term project that could span multiple semesters, and we could sort of keep adding different pieces of data or complementary data or more data, right, depending upon what exactly it is, that would culminate in something much bigger at the end. So that's something that I don't think that professors or even graduate students, when you're prepping courses, you always think about it that way. We also spend a lot of time thinking about our assignments and our assessments and how we can reuse work that we've already done in other formats. And then I'll talk today a little bit more about collaboration and how I think collaboration can be particularly helpful in this type of work. And I think that if you answer these questions, it's fine that you moved. I'm going to wait just a second before I talk about this. But if you answer these questions and really think prospectively before you start, then I really think you can, it will result in a much more efficient use of your time and maximize those long-term benefits. And I just want to note one thing, that if any of you have any experience with what's called backward design for course development. So D. Fink has got a lot of work in that area, as well as some other people. He's not the only one. This is in line with that, right? So I'm not talking in, somebody said yes, I'm not talking in as much detail about, we don't have that kind of structure that, for example, that Fink has in terms of how he actually advises you to design your courses backwards. But I'm talking about the same sort of things. So I've read some of his work. And so if you've done any of that or you're interested in that, that would be very complementary in some ways to the work that, that I'm talking about. So there's some overlap there. So I wanted to give you a few examples so that hopefully I can kind of give you an idea of what I mean by that big T, and an idea of how interdisciplinary collaboration can tie into this. So this example right here is my own work along with several colleagues. And so I know many of you may not be social scientists, but hopefully this can give you an idea of intersections in disciplines and how we broke things down into multiple pieces. So this is a project that at its very highest level was about community. It was focused mostly on public spaces in communities and how those impact relationships of individuals within the community or that you are using those public spaces. But we took a number of different angles. So this project spanned 5 years, I think, overall, of 5 different semesters over the course of 5 years of data, actually more than 5 semesters, because sometimes we did fall and spring, and we collected a number of different pieces of data. So we started what we saw one of the more easier pieces. We started with the urban design piece. We didn't have an urban designer, but we were definitely tapping into that literature. So that discipline's up there. And we did an observational data collection, a little bit, no human subjects, a little less intimidating, especially with a big group of students. And then we moved to, they don't actually go in order, we moved to in-person survey administration in parks with students doing that in-person survey administration. We also did, we did 2 rounds of that. We had a human geographer that came in and had a participatory GIS component that was added to our survey. And then towards the end, we did some more qualitative work and did focus groups and did a big 1,000-person mail survey to a number of residents. So it just built year after year after year. And some of these, we've been able to use some of those pieces of data together and then some of them in isolation. All that, of course, depends upon your topic and your question, your collaborators, but there's definitely, no matter what you're doing, if you've got an overarching theme that ties them together, you're going to be able to find some of those intersections. And one more note about this sort of big picture thinking and what drives that big picture question is, I would encourage you to think about the themes of your research and what you're interested in, but also think about what's going to serve you in the next few years. So think a little bit selfishly. If you're going to engage in this kind of work and spend a lot of time, you want to mentor students and give them a great experience, but I would always argue that you also want to make sure you're getting something towards publication out of it as well. There's no reason to, especially if you're collecting data, there's no reason not to design it in such a way that that data can help you as well. That's not making the student experience any worse, right? It might even make it better. And one other benefit we've had from this interdisciplinary collaboration has been more publications in the end. So we decided, there were 4 of us that engaged in this project for 3 or 4 years, and then Jocelyn and I have continued some work later, but we decided at the outset that we were going to take this data and that all 4 of us were going to take lead author on a paper, and we were going to collaborate together on each of those 4 papers. And so it wasn't always in our discipline specific journal, but it was tied into our research agenda. And so we were able to actually get a lot more bang for our buck, I think, because of those sort of connections and collaborations. So you can go ahead and, this is just one other little example that we put together as a graphic, although it doesn't have those specific questions because it's more outside our research areas. But climate change is a very timely topic, I'm sure I would be willing to bet there are at least a few people in this webinar right now that might be interested in that overall. And you might not think about some of these overlaps, right? So human geography and environmental management are probably 2 that might come to mind. When it comes to climate change, you can find some questions there. But you could also involve social scientists in multiple ways in a study of climate change, whether it is what's happening at a political level, state and local politics level, with legislation, but also public opinion. Sociologists could be interested in climate change from a public opinion and culture sort of standpoint. And then I came from, before I was at Kennesaw, I was at University of West Florida in Pensacola. So there was a lot of hospitality and tourism research going on. And so that might not be as relevant for some of you, but that is also very relevant for some parts of the country when it comes to climate change, at least, right? What is that doing to those disciplines? So hopefully that gave you just a little bit of specific examples to think through how you might bridge together multiple disciplines. The next thing I want to talk about a little bit is designing assignments and assessments. I'll mention that a little bit as well. And I'm going to give you a few examples. As I said before, I argue that we should really think about how we can revise before we redo when it comes to student assignments and rubrics and other types of assessments. So how could you design an assignment that might be able to be used with different groups of students? Not exactly the same, but with just a little bit of tweaking and changing. So for example, a literature review is a literature review, right? Regardless of the venue that you're using, it's still at its core the same product. The expectations that you put around that review and the expectations and point values and length, right? Some of those things might vary, but there's likely to be a core set of instructions that are the same, and perhaps even some pieces of the specifics that can be left the same, but used with different types of classes. Same thing for data collection activities and final papers or projects. I have a final paper or final paper / project assignment that I've only had to change little pieces of, and I've used it with I think 3 different courses. But it's not exactly the same. It's appropriate to the course, but there's a lot of the chunks of it that look the same. And so there's no reason to start over. Maybe some of you have already thought about this, but it took me a little while in teaching before I realized that I didn't have to start from the beginning every time I needed to design an assignment. So I'm going to show you one example from 2 different courses and kind of what I mean by different expectations or point values, that sort of thing. If you want to go ahead to the first one. So this is a portion of a final paper assignment. It's the portion that covers the literature review from my own research methods in criminal justice course. And so the assignment itself is much longer, right? It shows all the other sections of the paper. But this is what I have on that assignment about literature review. So it's about 1/3 of the paper. This is a 4,000 level class. And then I just give them some bullet points, some fairly broad bullet points about what should be included. Now, I provide some other resources about writing a literature review outside of this. This is not the only guidance they get, right? But in terms of the assignment itself, this is what it says. And then I actually require a draft, so I would give them feedback on the draft as well. But it's pretty high level. These students should know something about this type of writing already, but it's still literature review. If you want to go ahead to the next one, this is from my colleagues, freshman. It's an honors course, but it's a freshman level honors course, so they're still first year students. And that assignment, that portion of the paper, again, it's the same sort of big final or similar sort of final paper assignment. The literature review is shorter. Doesn't have to be as extensive. And then she's got some really detailed information. So she took sort of those bullet points. I actually can't remember if we went from hers to mine or mine to hers, but one of us went from one direction with the other's assignment and either expanded it or pulled it down. We did the same thing with the rubric. I don't have that shown up here, but I'd be happy to share it if anybody wants to see it. But she's got detailed information, right? Identify your resources. Give me a sentence or something that's very important from each of those resources. You can go on to the next. And then even more information, right? So I'm telling you really exactly what is expected of you to do with this information, telling them how to synthesize it basically, whereas mine assignment sort of assumes that they know how to synthesize at least to some degree. So I just saw somebody put that in the chat. I'll be happy to link any of the resources or any of the examples I've shown you up here. I can send them to Jerry or whoever and have them pass them along afterwards. Go ahead. So I guess, yeah, that's all. So I just think about that as you're going over assignments and rubrics, because I think there's ways you can reuse some of that information. The other thing, or another thing that I think is really important is really looking far and wide for resources that could be helpful to you. So if there's any availability for graduate or undergraduate teaching assistants, that would be sort of the #1 thing that I would say to look for if it's possible, because that saves you time, which is probably the most valuable resource when it comes to doing this type of work. So I know if you're a graduate student, you may not have any opportunities to have an assistant like that. If you're a graduate student and you're an instructor of record, you have the ability to be an instructor of record. That may give you a little bit more freedom. The other thing that I would suggest or to think about, and again, all institutions have different policies around this, so I don't know how you should check into your own institutional policy, but you could explore the idea of an undergraduate student who was really interested in the research topic or interested in working with students to do a directed study with you to help supervise the students. So I've actually done that with a graduate student before, a master's level student many years ago, but it could be done with an undergraduate student as well. So you've got one who's doing a directed study experience, but they're helping you manage the other the entire course-based research experience that you're doing. And then you would have, some specific research topic you'd be working through with them for their own course credit. But I think that's a way that sometimes you can work around the the need to hire somebody or the need to have that funding stream there. Lots of times universities have small grants that might be helpful for data collection if you need funds for that, as well as regional or national disciplinary associations. And then, as I mentioned before, I think faculty collaboration can be a really good way that can make your project more efficient and save you time, because you're got somebody else who's bearing some of the load for, at the very least, the research activities, right? So if it's your course, it's still your course, but you can likely have them do some guest lectures if you've got a collaborator who's really involved, and or help with the student management of data collection, data analysis, in any of those sorts of activities. So I think that can be a way to help. And then lastly, I know there are probably a number of graduate students in here. So I know some of the things that I'm saying probably might be harder for you to accomplish as a graduate student, but I hope that you can find some ways to utilize these strategies. And one thing I thought about with regards to this resources aspect, or sort of how would you do this as a graduate student, is again, I assume that if you're an instructor of record, you could just decide that you want to embed a cure in your course, and that can be your decision as the instructor of record. But if that's the case and you're really interested, you think you're interested in doing this long-term, or at least doing this multiple times after you become a faculty member, I would encourage you to try it out as an instructor of record if you can, and consider it planning and something that's going to be beneficial to you later in your career, right? That if you want to do this later, why not practice it now? Because it does take a few semesters to kind of figure out what's working best for you. And then secondly, if you're serving as a TA, but you really, really want to try out doing some of this work while you're in graduate school, then I would consider pitching a mutually beneficial project to the professor of that course and seeing if they would let you add that in as a component of the course, right? If you're already doing most of the grading and student supervision already, then you're probably not asking that professor to do a whole lot more than what they were already doing. They would obviously have to alter the structure of their course a little bit, but if you can pitch it as then we will end up with this nice data set that we can use for our research in the future, then it might go over. I don't know, it depends on the faculty member, but something to think about. Okay, go ahead. So the next thing I wanted to cover briefly is the importance of scaffolding projects throughout the semester. And I think this is important both from the student perspective, but also from the instructor perspective. So you want to set your students up. I assume we want to set our students up for success, right? And while we would like to think that if we assign a semester-long research project that students are going to chip away at it week after week throughout the semester, we all know that that's not actually likely to happen. And so I forced that by requiring multiple low-stakes assignments, especially early in the semester, but really throughout the whole semester. So you can see some of the examples of those assignments that I use listed there. I don't always use every single one of those in every course that I've done a project like this in, but I use most of them, and it depends a little bit on the course itself. But with those early assignments, I give a lot of feedback. I give a lot of written feedback, and I tell them very clearly the grade is not, like, as long as you turn in something that is, you made an effort to do what I asked you to do, you're going to get a good grade, and I'm going to give you really a lot of feedback to help you improve later. And so I think that takes a lot of the stress off of those earlier days, and it really sets them up for more success in the future. I'm going to give you some examples later when I get to the last online versus face-to-face. I'll give you some examples of how I have become more efficient in giving feedback, because that does take time. But I think although it takes more time at the beginning, I think you save time in the end. At least the way that I do it is I give this really rich, detailed feedback all semester long for these individual pieces. And then when I'm grading their final paper at the end, I'm using a rubric in our learning management system, and I'm checking the boxes on the rubric. And I'm usually not giving any more written feedback beyond that. If they ask for it, I'm happy to. But the reality is most students are not going back to look at that at the end of the semester. And so I think it's more valuable to spend that time early on. And then you don't get swamped with it during finals as well. Go ahead to the next. One other strategy I've used to make cures a little bit easier to handle in some semesters is by using groups or teams. to engage in projects. So it doesn't have to be, just because it's a cure doesn't mean it has to be each student doing their own project. You certainly can use groups. This is especially helpful if you have a larger class and you're really worried about being able to manage that many individual projects at once. I will tell you, so I did it 2 semesters in a row, and the first semester I learned a lot. Second semester it went a lot better. So I think if you are thinking about going this route, I would encourage you to do some reading in the project-based learning space. There's a lot of really good ideas about how to structure teams, and actually that was a deliberate switch. Actually, it was groups the first semester, it was teams the second. And I think language does matter a little bit. So spend some time looking into that literature. I will give you some of the most important things that I learned. The most important things I did differently that helped a lot was to engage in some team building at the beginning of the semester. So they had to come up with a team name. They decided on their projects collaboratively. They decided what they wanted to study together. And then I also built in a lot of mechanisms for individual accountability, because that's always the big thing, right? People who do group work, they're worried that everybody's not going to pull their load. So they had to write team contracts in which they decided what their own rules, right? Their own rules that they were all going to follow, and they signed them. So how quickly were they going to respond to email? What happened if they didn't show up on a day where they did a group project? Did they get, or did they, an activity? Did they get credit for that or not, right? There's just some of the things that they've discussed. And then I also utilized both individual and group assignments or team assignments. So for example, if they had an annotated bibliography due one day, every person in the team had to come in with their own individual 2 sources or so, summarize, and then they all put that together as their team assignment to turn in. But they were 2 separate grades. So if somebody didn't show up that day with their individual assignment, the team had already decided in their contract whether or not that person could get credit for the team assignment. So it helped to structure it in such a way that they decided what the consequences were, and then there was some real grade ramifications if they weren't there to participate in that team activity, which matters a lot. And then I think the importance, midpoint, having at least 2 assessments at the midpoint in the final at the end of the semester for peers is important, that are tied to a grade, right? Where team members evaluate each other. Go ahead. And then one of the last things I want to talk about is just to consider dissemination of these projects prior to starting, right? Make this part of your early considerations of the project as a whole. So many of you may have university symposia or departmental college showcases that happen every year, and a lot of institutions have those. So those are great options because, right, you don't have to do any planning or anything but telling them to sign up for it. So if those are available, I would encourage the use of those. There may be small or regional or state conferences that you can take students to for cheap or no money, you know, relatively cheap if they're close by. If this doesn't exist, you could also consider creating your own little poster session for your class. I have a colleague who did this because there was none of these other things were options. And he really wanted his students to be held accountable externally and have the experience of presenting externally. And so he just, you know, booked a room on campus. And yeah, somebody said virtual options. Yeah, that's a great idea now that we're not meeting. It's probably even easier to put up your own virtual little showcase now. But he just booked a room and invited a bunch of administrators and faculty to come see these students' projects and had them practice with him once, right? And it went really well, right? So it doesn't have to be something else that's already been organized, and it doesn't have to be a big thing that costs a lot of money or any other resources, right? Other than the time just to put it on. So, and I think he actually did it during class time, like the last day of class. But I just think at the end of the day, it's important to find some way for students to be held externally accountable. And that's really one of those other hallmarks of a high impact, of undergraduate research as a high impact practice. That's something that we find to be really important because it's that extra last step kind of that the students actually see where their work goes and what kind of impact it might have on others. Even if it's just others at the institution, it can still be meaningful. Go ahead. And then the last thing I wanted to cover for a few minutes is, especially now in the new world that we are in, some things that you could consider about doing this type of work in an online environment versus face-to-face, because it is kind of tricky, and I'm doing that this semester. And it's been going pretty well overall, as far as I can tell. You know, we're halfway through the semester, but I've made some decisions early on about how I was going to structure it in the online environment. So I think there are some benefits to technology, to having those technology or technological innovations to use, and that people are much more comfortable with them now. And I think that can be helpful for meeting with your students. So if I was going to require individual meetings with students on campus, that can get really difficult, right? They have to come to campus for a 15-minute meeting, and they might not be able to schedule it right outside of class or something like that. I've got to manage that in my own schedule. So, but I am requiring them to participate in 3 individual virtual meetings throughout the semester. And those are just quick, I call them project check-ins. They're not long, they're 5 to 15 minutes. And it's really just so that they know I'm going to ask them. They know I'm going to ask what's going on. What have you been writing? What have you been doing on your paper? Where are you? And it just gives them, and it helps really establish a better connection, right? Because I don't see them really any other way than that. And so after the first one, I came away at the end of that week, although it was tiring, I came away feeling really good because I felt like I knew my students much better after having those, even just those short conversations. The other thing that from a sort of technological video kind of standpoint is, I think it's important to consider that you're probably going to need other videos besides just the content videos or audio. I don't always do video, audio lectures perhaps that you may put up. It's worth your time most likely to also record some audio lectures or video lectures explaining the research project and explaining different components of it. Perhaps talking about how to find scholarly articles, right? All of these different components, things that you might show in class if you were teaching face-to-face. That's going to go at least some portion of the way towards reducing questions for you, because you can anticipate a lot of the questions that students are going to have. And if you can answer them in an already recorded audio file, then you can just, some students will just listen to it. They will never ask the question, but some of them, when they ask the question, you can say, did you watch this video? If not, go watch it and then tell me if you have questions. And so I think it has cut down on the amount of time I've spent answering questions to include those in my class. I also think, especially with an online class where you're not seeing the students regularly, it's important to keep really detailed records of your communication with students about the project. So I'll show you an example of that in a minute, as well as comments that can be reused later. So I'll give you an example of both of those two things in 1 second and come back to them. It's also worthwhile to take advantage of peer review in this type of environment, that students can send each other their own work. You can pair them up, you can put them in groups, you can do it multiple different ways, but let them help each other with some of the portions of this as you move forward. And then I do think that it's worthwhile to consider using secondary data or collecting data using one single survey instrument. Again, this is very social science specific, right? So I think biology, chemistry, some of the other STEM disciplines might be harder to think about data collection in the online space. So I realize if you need to be in a lab, that brings its own problems. So I can think about some strategies and suggestions if people have questions about that later on. But there is an article that I will link that. I will send the full citation for that when I send the other materials if anybody wants to look at it. They are doing research in the geosciences. And the way they structured a whole undergraduate research project where students came up with public opinion questions about their research topic. And then they went out and collected data from 15 or 20 people on their public opinions about a science topic. So that's sort of how they were able to tie in a more STEM field with still data collection in undergraduate research. Go ahead if you want to move forward. So the next 2 slides have a ton of text on them. Don't try to read it. I'm just trying to give you an example, a snapshot of how I have done both this record keeping and then student comments. So this is a Google sheet that I have, and I've cut off the student names, but it's got a student name associated with it. So I put their research question, when did they do their first project check-in? And then after I talked to them, I made these really short notes about what we talked about. Did they have past research experience? Did they seem confident? Did they seem like they had no idea what they were doing? That sort of thing. And then I indicated whether or not I thought they needed to be sent a follow-up email. So did it see if there were some people that seemed like, I just really am having trouble. I don't understand what's happening. So for those individuals, AM is my graduate teaching assistant. So I do have a teaching assistant in this course. I indicated whether I was going to send an email or I wanted her to send an email. And just following up the next week saying, hey, everything going all right? Do you need any help as you move forward with your project? No one wrote back to us and said they did, but we sent them nonetheless. And then I'll add more columns to this as I do the second group. I'm actually doing my second round of check-ins this week. If you want to go to the next slide. And then again, this is a lot of text, so don't try to read through the whole thing, but this is a portion of a file that I save called, I can't remember, it might be from a midterm. It's feedback for one of those feedback from one of those scaffolded assignments. And so what I do is I don't give everybody word for word the same feedback, right? But students make the same mistakes, and there are lots of times when they need the same suggestion. And so I will tweak this as needed, right? If somebody does something specific or I need to speak specifically to their topic, I will certainly add that in as needed. But there are a lot of times like that paragraph on citations, that comes up all the time. People don't cite correctly. I can copy and paste that in because that's the exact same thing they need to know. And so I save this and I reuse these comments over and over again. And it saves me a lot of time from having to retype the whole thing back in everyone's papers, but I'm able to give them a lot of detailed feedback at the same time. Okay, go ahead. I think that might be the end. Yeah, so I think that's the last part I have. Do we have time to do breakout rooms?
Sarah, we've got some great questions. So we thought we might just do Q&A and then maybe forget the breakout rooms just for today, because I think there's some really great questions in the chat. And so I'm going to just jump to actually, I'm going to stop. Why don't we stop sharing and we can just do it this way? Everyone can see each other. And I've written down the questions on my phone, summarizing from the chat. Okay. Two quick ones.
Well, then I'll just let you tell me and I won't try to read.
Yeah, I'll sort of moderate them or field them. So I'll give you the quick ones first. These could probably be quick yes, no answers or something real short. How many students are you talking about in a typical class?
So it varies. I've done this. I've done it on my own with 30 to 40 students. Now on my own, sometimes with a teaching assistant, but as the only main faculty member involved. The big project that I talked about that spanned multiple years, that was involved anywhere from 2 to 4 faculty members, and it was anywhere from 75 to 120 students.
Wow, okay.
So it depends on the semester, and I've also done it with a group of, they were technically directed study students, but there were 13 of them across 2 sections with 2 faculty members, so it was closer to the size of an actual class, although small class, right? So I've done it from across the spectrum.
What about IRB, Institutional Review Board approval? What does that look like? Do you and your co-faculty that are in these classes, do you all apply for the IRB or do students do the IRB application?
Yes, so we have done the IRB in the past because we've had, if students are interacting with human subjects, they have to get certified, right? So that may be an assignment. Sometimes that's an assignment in my course if they're gonna have to do that. But the actual IRB application for the research project, I'll show it to them and we'll talk about it. But I just, from a timing perspective, I've always felt like it made more sense to go ahead and do it ahead of time. And just one note also about Scholarship of Teaching and Learning research. I think I forgot to say this in the place I was going to say it in the presentation, but I would always encourage you to think prospectively also about what type of Scholarship of Teaching and Learning research you could potentially do with this, and do an IRB for that too. So you have to do a second IRB for student assessment data, but it shouldn't be a problem getting through most IRBs. But think about what type of assessment course data and course student experience data you could collect along the way that you could then get another publication out of that.
So what I think is really masterful about what you've done in your career is this is a lot of work, but you're passionate about it, you enjoy it, and you've leveraged it into publications, which you need for tenure and promotion as a faculty member at the same time.
Mhm.
How do you give students credit for their involvement in research? Is it an acknowledgement? Do you co-author with students? What does that look like?
I've done both. We've done a number of things. In projects where students were really very integrated in collecting the data. Most of the time we've had at least one student co-author. That's sometimes been a graduate student. It hasn't always been one of the undergraduate students. But we have, when students are collecting data, we have always taken them to some type of conference. So we've made sure that they're going to get public credit for it in that way. For most students, that's really all they would want to do. They're not really interested in being actual writers on the manuscripts. We would certainly be open to that. We have had undergraduate students as co-authors if they were very interested in what we were doing and motivated to do that. I'm trying to think how else we've, with graduate students, it's a little bit easier, right? Undergraduate students, it more often takes the role of presentations and authorship on presentations. And then if they express great interest, then we would also ask them, talk with them about publications.
For the undergraduate students, it helps them with their graduate school applications to have some presentations. Like it's really developing them as professionals and you know.
And that's usually the way we try to pitch it to the undergraduate students, is that if you can take this to a conference, that's going to look really good. Even if you don't ever want to get a PhD, you don't ever want to go into academia. If you think you're going to get a master's degree, this is going to help you no matter what. This is going to be beneficial for you in that process.
Lots more questions. Let me get to another one. The strategies you talked about with cures, do you think those are generalizable to mentored research, or do you think it's kind of unique to a cure?
No, I think a lot of them probably are generalizable. So, I mean, the stuff about designing assignments and that sort of thing, I use the same assignments with directed study students as I do in my course. So I wouldn't redo a new assignment. I mean, I might have to make some small changes depending upon what the expectations were for that student. But I've certainly used the same sort of final project, final paper assignment, both with individual students and in courses. Some of the other stuff, I think it kind of depends. So if you think about think long-term, think big picture, and then break it down into smaller pieces, that is going to be, it's going to be unique to what your specific research agenda is, right? Because I don't know depending upon what those smaller questions are, that's going to drive whether or not a chunk of that could be accomplished with one or two students in a semester. So it's going to be dependent upon that. So for example, we collected 400 in-person surveys over the course of 2 semesters of people park users. We couldn't have done that if we didn't have 75 or 80 students.
Yep.
That wasn't going to happen, right? And so, and it wasn't a big burden on the students. They each only had to do a few. And so that wouldn't be possible with in a directed study environment. So I think it kind of depends on what it is you're trying to accomplish.
What about, there was a question here about responsible conduct of research training for your students. Do you have them do the CITI training? That's pretty standard across the whole
CITI
country.
training is what's required at my institution.
Same here, same at my previous institution. So CITI training, many institutional review boards require you to complete CITI training before you can even file an IRB application. And it's pretty standard across the country. So
I have been able to get now, I guess not at Kennesaw yet, but my previous institution, I was able to get IRB projects approved by stating that every student would be CITI certified. So the students didn't have, I don't know if that varies or not, but I was able to say, this will be an assignment in my course and students will not participate in data collection unless they complete this assignment.
So some of the folks that are on the call today could be in faculty positions already. I'm willing to bet a lot of the folks on the call want to be in faculty positions someday after they complete their master's doctoral work. Can you talk a little bit about how, like when you're interviewing for a job, how is it that you can sort of feel out that you're interviewing at a department that values this work, right? Like I know that's something we've talked about that's really important because cures take a lot of work, but yet you're building your research agenda at the same time, and you don't want to land in a department where the colleagues are like, well, that doesn't count. You got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. And it can be tricky, especially when you're just at the interview stage. So, I mean, I would say tread a little carefully as you're asking those questions, unless you absolutely do not want to end up somewhere where it's not valued. If you feel very strongly about that, then say, ask whatever you want to ask and be as direct as you want to be. But if you want to be a little bit more careful about digging into that at the early outset, I would probably start with a discussion of high impact practices, because I think high impact practices is so big across academia and higher education right now in general, that I don't think anybody's going to look at you and think, why are they talking about high impact practices? Right. So I think that can be a way to bridge into the conversation and see what the reaction is there. And then perhaps sort of explore if you get a lot of enthusiasm, or if you get I don't know what this is, then maybe tell them a little bit about what it is. But if you do that, focus on the outcomes, focus on what we know it does for retention and grades and student engagement, right? But, and then maybe just kind of dip your toe in that, say, well, have you ever had any faculty members engage in undergraduate research with their students? And I think the answer to that question will probably go a long way. In my mind, I think that answer would tell you a lot about the value of that work, right? Because if nobody's doing it and nobody's ever done it, then they probably don't value it very much. And, you may find the chair might say, we've had a few people do it. Students love it. We wish we had more. I think that can give you some of that information out without having to say, if I get a publication in a Scholarship of Teaching and Learning journal, will it count? Which may ultimately be what you want, the answer you want, but you might not have to ask it that bluntly to get at least an idea of what it is.
Someone asked a question in the chat. This isn't a fair question for you or me to answer given our disciplinary background, but what would a cure look like for a lab course and one that's transitioning online? I've been thinking about this one for the last 20 minutes since it popped in.
Yeah.
We've got some colleagues at other institutions who teach lab-based courses online. They've been doing it before COVID-19. And what they've done is created these simulations where students can do a lab simulation at home on their computer or on their device. And so I think faculty and instructors who have thought about doing that for a longer period of time have probably been better positioned into doing that now versus those who are used to teaching a course in a lab, right? With equipment, and you don't have that anymore. How do you transition that? I think you got to get pretty creative in how you might do that.
Yeah, I haven't even read a lot or heard a lot about about how people are doing that online. We do have colleagues who've done in the University of Wisconsin system who have done both biology courses and chem courses that are lab courses, and they have done a full cure that spans across the entire course. So I know it can be done. I could, if you have specific questions, it could probably put you in touch with them. I think they'd be more than happy to talk about it, but they've been able to design the course so that students had their own project that and during the lab time, they were working on collecting data for that project. Now, how exactly tied into the other learning outcomes of the course, I can't speak to directly, but.
Someone asked for, at least the example I think I'm talking about to share, it sits behind a learning management system wall. So I can't readily share it with you. That's the hard part. But let me reach out to the colleague who I know has developed this, and I'm going to take a picture of who this is, and I'll see if I could reach out to you. If you want to reach out to me, here's my email address. I'll put it in the chat. If that was the person who I think it was that asked the question, I'm happy to connect you with a couple of faculty members who I know have done this work, and maybe they'll be willing to share it with you. But they've developed these simulations for anatomy and physiology classes. Where it's just, it's pretty creative and innovative, but it's not something you could do immediately. It's stuff that they've built up over years as they transition their face-to-face course to online. Folks have mentioned things like Slack and other resources that you can use that, you're all probably far more technological savvy than I am. And, it's going out and finding things that you can use to integrate into your courses. We're getting close to time. I just want to throw this in the chat too. Sarah and I are part of High Impact Practices in the States, HIPS in the States. We've got a listserv of about 2,500 members, and we are, a part of our conference has now been folded into the IUPUI Assessment Institute. If you're interested, I think the Assessment Institute registration is closed now, but next year will likely be virtual again. If you want to be part of our listserv, if you want to engage with us with high impact practices in the States, you can send me an email. There's our website. You can look at some of our previous conference programs there. If you want to get connected to this high impact practice field, let us know and we can add you to the listserv. You're welcome to just send me an email. Sarah, thanks so much for doing this for us today. Really appreciate it. Really good questions, really good information. Kate, you have the PowerPoint. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say, Kate, but I'll turn it over to you right now. Thanks so much for everyone for participating today.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, everyone who participated in our discussion today. We'll send out an email with that post-event survey in it, and we'll also be updating the event webpage, and we'll include this in the email as well, with any additional resources that we get from Sarah or Jerry, knowing that some people had specific questions about a rubric for some of these assignments, things like that. So as we're able to get specific resources that aren't behind an LMS, we will do what we can to share them, and the event webpage will be the place to go for any resources that we can share.
And it looks like, Kate, the registration's open till 5 p.m. today for the Assessment Institute. So folks here,
Great.
It's a free registration. You can go ahead and register and participate in the Hips in the States track if you wanted to, or any of the other stuff associated with the Assessment Institute. So I'd encourage you to register if you have time today before 5 p.m.
Thank you guys for having me. I put my email in the chat. I think it's scrolled up now, but it's also at the end of the PowerPoint slides on the last slide if you go download that later. I will share both assignments and rubrics I talked about today, but if you have any other questions, please feel free to email. I'm happy to help if I can.
Thanks, everyone.